Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1. The Endless Rain. The drive to Blackwood Forest was filled with laughter and anticipation. Emma, Jake, Sarah, Ben, and Lily had planned the trip for weeks, eager to leave behind the suffocating city for a weekend of nature, campfires, and adventure. Blackwood Forest was infamous for its mist-shrouded beauty, with legends whispering of strange happenings in the deep woods. But the friends dismissed such stories as folklore meant to thrill tourists. By late afternoon, they reached the forest's edge, greeted by towering pines that seemed to pierce the heavens. The air was cool and damp, carrying the faint smell of moss and wet earth. Setting up camp near a clearing, they marveled at the dense fog rolling in, giving the landscape an otherworldly charm. "This is going to be perfect," Emma said, stretching her arms. "Just us in the wild." Jake grinned. "And maybe a ghost or two, if we're lucky." Ben groaned. "Don't start, Jake. No ghost stories tonight." Sarah and Lily chuckled, busying themselves with the tent poles. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the fog thickened, curling around their campsite like a living thing. The friends didn't mind. It added a cozy, mysterious vibe to their evening. By the time darkness fully embraced the forest, the group was gathered around a crackling fire, roasting marshmallows and swapping tales. The sound of the forest, a symphony of chirping crickets and rustling leaves, was soothing. Then came the rain. At first, it was a soft drizzle, almost gentle. They scrambled to cover the fire and secure their gear, laughing as they got wet. But the rain quickly turned strange. It wasn't cold like normal rain. Instead, it felt thick, almost sticky, clinging to their skin and clothes. "What is this?" Jake said, holding out his hand. The droplets shimmered under the flashlight, unnaturally slick and metallic. Emma sniffed the air. "Do you smell that? It's like iron." Lily rubbed her arm, grimacing. "It's oily, and it stinks." Ben wiped his face, his hand coming away smeared with the strange substance. "Is this even rain?" The metallic scent grew stronger, almost overpowering, as if the forest itself was exhaling rust. The friends retreated to their tents, seeking refuge from the unnatural downpour. Inside, the sound of the rain was deafening, a relentless drumbeat that made conversation nearly impossible. They huddled together in one tent, their flashlights casting sharp beams into the damp, dark corners. "Maybe it's some kind of industrial pollution," Sarah suggested, her voice trembling. "In the middle of a forest?" Jake countered. The air inside the tent grew heavy, the metallic odor seeping through the fabric. Then they heard it, a faint whisper, so soft they thought it might be the rain itself. But the sound grew clearer, words indistinct yet undeniably human. "Did you hear that?" Lily whispered, her eyes wide. Emma nodded, her hand tightening around the flashlight. "It's coming from outside." Jake unzipped the tent slightly, peering into the darkness. The forest was eerily still, the fog illuminated by their flashlights. But the whispers persisted, circling them like invisible predators. Suddenly, Sarah gasped, clutching her arm. "What is this?" The group turned their lights on her. Thin, glowing lines were spreading across her skin, branching like veins. They pulsed faintly, a sickly yellow hue that matched the rain's shimmer. "It's the rain," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "It's doing something to me." Panic set in as they checked their own bodies. Jake's hands bore the same glowing marks, and Ben's neck had a streak that pulsed like a heartbeat. "We need to leave," Emma said, her voice firm despite her fear. "Now." They grabbed their belongings and bolted from the tent, the oily rain soaking them instantly. The fog had thickened to the point where visibility was nearly zero. The whispers followed them, growing louder, almost urgent. "This way," Jake shouted, leading them toward what he thought was the trail. But the forest seemed to twist and shift around them. The trees loomed larger, their gnarled branches stretching out like skeletal arms. The ground beneath their feet became slick with mud, pulling at their boots as if trying to trap them. Lily screamed, pointing ahead. A figure stood in the fog, barely visible, but unmistakably human-shaped. It didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there watching. "Who's there?" Ben shouted, his voice cracking. The figure dissolved into the fog as if it had never been there. The whispers turned into a cacophony, voices overlapping, each one calling their names. Emma grabbed Jake's arm. "We're going in circles," she cried, pointing to a familiar broken branch they'd passed earlier. As the rain continued to pour, their bodies grew heavier, the glowing marks spreading and pulsing more intensely. Their breaths came in ragged gasps, the metallic odor filling their lungs. Finally, they stumbled into a clearing. At its center stood an ancient stone altar, slick with the oily rain. Strange symbols were carved into its surface, glowing faintly, their patterns eerily similar to the marks on their bodies. "What is this place?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. Before anyone could answer, the whispers coalesced into a single, booming voice. "You were chosen." The ground trembled, and the rain seemed to intensify, pooling around the altar. The glowing symbols pulsed in time with the marks on their bodies, creating an unbearable resonance. Lily collapsed to her knees, clutching her head. "Make it stop, please." The fog thickened, enveloping them completely. Shadowy figures emerged, their forms shimmering with the same metallic sheen as the rain. Their faces were indistinct, their eyes glowing like molten gold. The friends tried to run, but the rain had turned the ground into a viscous trap. The shadowy figures moved closer, their hands outstretched. "You cannot escape," the voice intoned. One by one, the friends were pulled toward the altar, their screams swallowed by the rain. The glowing marks on their bodies flared brilliantly before fading into darkness. By dawn, The clearing was empty. The rain had stopped, and the fog began to lift. Blackwood Forest stood silent, as if untouched by the horrors of the night. But deep in the woods, the altar remained, its symbols glowing faintly, waiting for the next rain to fall. Story 2. Drowned by the past. The storm hit with little warning, the sky darkening as if the sun had been snuffed out by an unseen hand. Thunder growled ominously in the distance as Jack hastily packed his gear. He had been hiking through the dense woods near Pine Hollow and hadn't expected such a sudden change in weather. What started as a light drizzle quickly became a downpour, soaking him to the bone within minutes. The forest transformed under the rain, shadows deepening, and the once familiar trail becoming a maze of slick roots and muddy patches. Jack pushed forward, searching for shelter as the wind howled through the trees, carrying the scent of wet earth and pine. Then he saw it, a stone well, partially hidden by the dense undergrowth. It stood in a small clearing, its weathered stones coated in moss and grime, the kind of structure that looked as if it had been forgotten by time. Desperate to escape the rain, Jack made his way to the well and crouched beside it, using the low wall as a makeshift barrier against the storm. As he caught his breath, the storm seemed to intensify. Lightning illuminated the clearing in harsh flashes, and the accompanying thunder reverberated through the forest like a primal roar. Jack shivered, pulling his jacket tighter around himself. That's when he noticed something odd, a faint, rhythmic sound that didn't match the storm's chaos. Drip, drip, drip. It was coming from the well. Jack hesitated, his curiosity warring with a growing sense of unease. Leaning over the edge, he aimed his flashlight into the darkness. The beam barely penetrated the void, revealing only the damp, crumbling interior of the well. The dripping sound continued, steady and deliberate, as though someone or something was moving within. "Hello," Jack called, his voice echoing down the shaft. No response, just a drip, drip, drip. He was about to dismiss it as his imagination when a low, wet rasp echoed from the depths. The sound was faint but unmistakably human. A gasp, followed by a strained, guttural breath. Jack's stomach knotted as the realization hit him. Someone might be trapped down there. "Are you okay?" he shouted, his voice trembling. "Do you need help?" Again, no answer, but the rasping breaths grew louder, joined by the faint scrape of something against stone. Jack peered closer, his heart hammering in his chest. Then he saw it. A pale, waterlogged hand emerged from the darkness, its fingers clawing at the edge of the well. The hand was bloated and discolored, the skin wrinkled and sagging as if it had been submerged for far too long. Jack stumbled back, his flashlight shaking as he struggled to process what he was seeing. The rest of the figure followed. Slowly, agonizingly, it climbed out of the well. Its movements were stiff and jerky, water cascading from its tattered clothing in thick rivulets. The figure's hair hung in wet clumps, obscuring its face, and its skin glistened with an unnatural sheen, pale and sickly under the flashlight's beam. Jack couldn't move. His legs felt like lead as the figure turned its head toward him. Through the curtain of matted hair, he glimpsed its eyes, dark, hollow sockets that seemed to bore into his soul. It raised a trembling hand and pointed at him. "Where is she?" The voice was barely more than a whisper, but it carried an edge of desperation that made Jack's blood run cold. He shook his head, stumbling backward. "I don't know what you're talking about." The figure took a step closer, water pooling around its feet. "She was here," it rasped. "She called to me." Jack's mind raced. Was this some kind of ghost? A hallucination brought on by the storm? He forced himself to speak. "Who are you looking for? Maybe I can help." The figure didn't respond immediately. Instead, it raised its head, revealing more of its ruined face. Its features were sunken, its lips split and peeling. Despite its ghastly appearance, there was a profound sorrow in its expression, a grief that seemed to radiate from its very being. "Eleanor," it said finally, the name hanging in the air like a mournful cry. She promised she would wait. Jack felt a chill that had nothing to do with the rain. "Who's Eleanor?" The figure swayed, its gaze distant. "She was mine. We were to leave this place together, but she lied. She left me to drown." The last word was spat with venom, and the figure's entire demeanor shifted. The sorrow was replaced by anger, its hollow eyes narrowing as it advanced on Jack. "Wait!" Jack shouted, holding up his hands. "I'm not Eleanor. I don't even know her." The figure paused, its head tilting unnaturally. "Then why do I hear her voice? She calls to me, even now." Jack had no answer. His pulse thundered in his ears as he tried to think. The storm seemed to intensify around them, the rain falling harder, the wind howling like a wild beast. Desperate for answers, Jack glanced at the well. On its weathered stones, he noticed faint markings, symbols carved into the surface, barely visible beneath the moss. They didn't look like anything he'd seen before, their jagged lines and spirals radiating an unsettling energy. "Is she connected to the well?" Jack asked, his voice trembling. "Did something happen here?" The figure's gaze followed Jack's to the well, and for a moment it seemed to soften. "We made a promise," it said, almost to itself. "By this well, we were to run away, to escape her father's wrath. But she never came, only the water, the cold, black water." Jack's stomach churned as the pieces fell into place. This wasn't just a ghost. It was a remnant of a tragic love story, one that had ended in betrayal and death. "I don't think she's here," Jack said cautiously. "But maybe we can find her. Maybe we can make things right." The figure turned to him, its expression unreadable. For a moment, Jack thought it might accept his offer, but then its features twisted into a mask of rage. "You lie?" it hissed, its voice echoing unnaturally. "You're like her, deceitful, treacherous." Before Jack could react, the figure lunged, its cold, what hands reaching for him. He scrambled backward, narrowly avoiding its grasp. The storm howled louder, the clearing seeming to close in around him. "I'm sorry," Jack shouted, his voice barely audible over the wind. "I don't know where she is." The figure froze, its hollow eyes fixed on him. Slowly it retreated, sinking back toward the well. "You will tell her," it said, its voice barely audible. "Tell her I waited. Tell her I will always wait." And with that, it disappeared into the darkness of the well, leaving Jack alone in the storm. When the rain finally ceased, Jack staggered back to his campsite, his mind reeling. He couldn't shake the image of the figure or the weight of its words. As dawn broke, he packed his things and left Pine Hollow, vowing never to return. But even as he drove away, the sound of dripping water lingered in his mind, a haunting reminder of the past that refused to be forgotten. Story 3. Footsteps in the mud. The rain began as a light drizzle, a soothing patter on the fabric of Rachel's tent as she settled in for her first night alone in the wilderness. She'd camped with friends before, but this solo trip was something she'd been planning for months. A chance to reconnect with nature and find a little peace after a stressful year. Pine Hollow Forest was the perfect spot, isolated, beautiful, and with trails that promised breathtaking views. But as night fell, the drizzle turned into a relentless downpour. The sound of raindrops against her tent grew louder, drowning out the natural chorus of crickets and rustling leaves. Rachel wrapped herself tighter in her sleeping bag, reassuring herself that the weather would pass by morning. Hours ticked by. The rain showed no signs of letting up. She tried to focus on the rhythm of it, letting the white noise lull her to sleep. But then she heard it, something that didn't belong. A squelch. Rachel froze, her breath hitching. She waited, straining to hear over the storm. For a moment, there was nothing but the steady drumming of rain. Then it came again, a wet, deliberate squelch, like someone stepping in thick mud. Her heart quickened. It was probably an animal, she told herself. Deer, raccoons, maybe even a bear. She reached for her flashlight, fumbling in the dark. If it got too close, she'd flash the light and scare it off. But as she listened, the footsteps didn't wander aimlessly as an animal's might. They circled her tent, one step, then another. Each squelch seemed slow, deliberate, as though whoever or whatever was outside was taking its time. The sound sent a chill down her spine. "Hello," she called out, trying to keep her voice steady. The footsteps stopped. Rachel's pulse thundered in her ears as she gripped the flashlight tighter. "If someone's out there, this isn't funny. I have a knife." She didn't, but she hoped the bluff would be enough. For a moment, the only sound was the rain hammering against the tent. Then the footsteps resumed, circling again, slower this time. Rachel's mind raced. Who would be out here in the middle of nowhere? The nearest trailhead was miles away, and she hadn't seen another soul since she'd arrived. The footsteps stopped directly in front of the tent's entrance. Her breath caught as she stared at the zipper, half expecting it to start sliding down. Her flashlight beam danced across the fabric as her hands trembled. But nothing happened. Minutes passed, stretching into an eternity. Finally, the footsteps started again, moving away this time. The sound grew fainter until it was swallowed by the rain. Rachel exhaled shakily, her body relaxing just enough for her to feel the ache in her muscles. She considered waiting until morning to investigate, but knew she wouldn't sleep unless she confirmed what had been outside. Taking a deep breath, she unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The rain was still falling heavily, making it hard to see beyond the immediate area. She shone her flashlight across the ground, scanning for any sign of movement. Her beam landed on them. Footprints. They were large, barefoot, and unmistakably human. The prints were deep, each step sinking into the saturated earth. They led away from her tent, disappearing into the darkness of the woods. But as she traced their path back, her blood ran cold. There were no prints leading to the tent. Her mind reeled. How could that be? She had clearly heard footsteps circling her, stopping right at the entrance. But the mud around her tent was undisturbed except for the trail leading away. A sudden crack of thunder made her jump, and she instinctively ducked back into the tent, zipping it shut. Her hands shook as she fumbled for her phone, hoping to call for help. But there was no signal, not out here. Rachel sat in the darkness, clutching her flashlight like a lifeline. The storm raged on, and every creak of a tree or rustle of the wind made her flinch. She thought about packing up and leaving, but the thought of walking through the woods in this weather, possibly with someone or something lurking nearby, was too terrifying. Hours dragged by. The rain eventually began to lighten, and the first hints of dawn peeked through the treetops. Rachel hadn't slept a second, her ears straining for any sign of the footsteps returning. When the storm finally subsided, she unzipped the tent again, stepping out into the damp morning air. Her flashlight beam wasn't needed anymore. The soft light of dawn revealed the clearing in stark detail. The footprints were still there, leading away into the trees. Gathering her courage, Rachel decided to follow them. She couldn't leave without knowing what had been outside her tent. The trail led deeper into the forest, winding through the underbrush. The footprints remained consistent, each step spaced evenly as though the person or thing had been walking with purpose. After about a quarter of a mile, the trail ended abruptly at a large, ancient oak tree. Its gnarled roots twisted through the earth like the fingers of a giant hand. Beneath its canopy, the ground was dry despite the night's rain. There, carved into the bark, was a symbol. It was a crude spiral, etched deeply into the wood, with smaller lines radiating outward like a sunburst. Rachel reached out to touch it, her fingers brushing against the rough grooves. A sudden rush of cold air swept through the clearing, and for a moment, the forest seemed to hold its breath. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end as she turned, half expecting to see someone standing behind her. But she was alone. The trail of footprints didn't resume on the other side of the tree. It was as if whoever had made them had vanished. Rachel hurried back to her campsite, her nerves frayed. She packed up her gear in record time, constantly glancing over her shoulder. The forest felt different now, the shadows longer and the silence oppressive. As she drove away, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. That night, safe in her apartment, Rachel replayed the events in her mind. She searched online for any information about Pine Hollow Forest, hoping to find an explanation. What she found chilled her to the bone. Decades ago, the forest had been the site of a small settlement. One of its residents, a reclusive man accused of witchcraft, had vanished after being chased by an angry mob. Legend said he'd cursed the land before disappearing, vowing to haunt anyone who dared disturb his solitude. Rachel closed her laptop, her heart pounding. She hadn't disturbed anything, or had she? As she lay in bed, the sound of rain began tapping against her window. She closed her eyes, trying to convince herself it was just a storm. Then she heard it, a wet squelch. Story 4. The Flooded Campsite. The Larson family had always loved their summer camping trips. This year, they decided to camp by the banks of the Serpentine River, a quiet, winding waterway nestled deep in the national forest. The spot was perfect. Tall trees for shade, a serene view of the river, and no other campers in sight. See, wasn't this a great idea? Dan Larson said, grinning as he helped his wife, Marcy, pitch their tent. Their 2 kids, Emily and Noah, were skipping stones near the riverbank, their laughter mingling with the rustle of the trees. Perfect, Marcy agreed, her hands brushing stray hair from her face. But only if it doesn't rain. Dan waved off her concern. Forecast says clear skies. As evening fell, the family gathered around a small campfire, roasting marshmallows and telling stories. The river's gentle flow was a comforting backdrop, and the soft croak of frogs added to the atmosphere. By the time they crawled into their sleeping bags, the Larsons felt the kind of peace that only comes from being surrounded by nature. Dan woke to the sound of water. At first, he thought it was rain, but the sound was too loud and constant. He sat up, his head brushing against the sagging roof of the tent. The air was damp, and the ground beneath him felt wrong. "Marcy," he whispered, shaking her shoulder. "Something's not right." Marcy stirred groggily, her eyes widening as she noticed the water pooling at the tent's edge. "What the?" The kids woke next, their murmurs of confusion turning to alarm as the reality set in. The river had flooded during the night, and their campsite was submerged. The tent wasn't on solid ground anymore. It was floating. "Stay calm," Dan said, though his voice betrayed his rising panic. He unzipped the tent, peering out into the dim light of dawn. The river had swollen far beyond its banks, carrying debris and churning with an unsettling intensity. Their tent had drifted into the middle of what was now a vast, murky expanse. "How did this happen?" Marcy asked, clutching Noah close. Emily's eyes were wide with fear, her hands gripping her sleeping bag like a lifeline. Probably a flash flood, Dan replied, scanning the surroundings. We need to get to higher ground, but there was no higher ground in sight. The trees they'd camped under were half submerged, their tops barely visible. The current was too strong to swim against, and their gear had floated away in the night. Then Dan saw it. Something was moving in the water. It was a ripple at first, a subtle disturbance in the surface that could easily have been a branch or a fish. But as it drew closer, the shape beneath the water became clearer. It was humanoid. Dan's heart skipped a beat. "Stay inside," he said, his voice low and urgent. "What is it?" Marcy asked, her tone sharp with fear. "I don't know. Just stay quiet." The family huddled together, the walls of the tent offering little comfort. The water lapped at the fabric as the shape circled the tent, its movements unnervingly deliberate. Through the tent's thin material, Dan caught glimpses of it. Long, pale limbs that moved with an unnatural grace, webbed fingers breaking the surface of the water. Its head occasionally bobbed above the waves, but he couldn't make out its features. "Dad," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "What is it?" "I don't know," Dan admitted, "but we're not going to wait around to find out." He searched the tent for anything they could use. Their food, supplies, and even their paddles were gone, carried away by the flood. All they had was a flashlight, a pocket knife, and each other. The creature bumped against the tent, the force enough to make them all flinch. It didn't seem to be attacking, but its presence was enough to send waves of terror through the family. "We need to move," Dan said, his voice barely audible. "If we stay here, we're sitting ducks. But where do we go?" Marcy asked, her eyes darting toward the water. "Anywhere but here." Dan carefully unzipped the tent and peered outside. The creature was circling again, its movements slow and almost predatory. He waited until it was on the far side of the tent before stepping out into the water. It was freezing, the cold biting through his clothes as he waded carefully. "Come on," he whispered, motioning for the others. Slowly, Marcy helped Emily and Noah climb out, each of them shivering as they followed Dan. The water came up to their waists, making every step a struggle. They moved as quietly as they could, their eyes darting between the trees and the murky water. Then it happened, a splash. The creature had noticed them. "Run!" Dan shouted, grabbing Emily's hand and pulling her toward the nearest tree. Marcy followed with Noah, their movements frantic as the water slowed them down. The creature lunged, its pale form breaking the surface with a guttural, inhuman sound. Dan shoved Emily ahead, turning to face it. For the first time, he got a clear look at its face. It was vaguely human, but grotesquely distorted. Its eyes were large and black, devoid of emotion. Gills flared on the sides of its neck, and its mouth was filled with jagged, uneven teeth. It let out a screech that made Dan's blood run cold. He splashed at it with all his might, trying to create a distraction. "Go!" he shouted over his shoulder. Marcy and the kids reached the tree, scrambling onto its partially submerged roots. Dan followed, the creature hot on his heels. He hauled himself onto the roots just as the creature lunged, its webbed hands clawing at the bark. "Leave us alone," Marcy screamed, throwing a branch at it. The creature hissed, its black eyes narrowing. It circled the tree, its pale form blending eerily with the murky water. The family clung to the tree, their breaths ragged and their hearts pounding. Hours passed. The creature didn't leave. It swam in slow circles, occasionally diving beneath the surface. Every time it reappeared, its eyes were fixed on them. As the sun climbed higher, the water began to recede. Slowly but surely, the river returned to its banks, revealing the muddy ground beneath. The creature, sensing its advantage slipping away, made one last attempt. It surged toward the tree, its claws raking the bark. Dan swung a heavy branch at it, the impact forcing it back into the water. It let out a final, ear-piercing screech before disappearing beneath the surface. The family didn't wait to see if it would return. They stumbled back toward the remnants of their campsite, their legs weak and their clothes soaked. Most of their belongings were gone, but they didn't care. They just wanted to leave. By the time they reached their car, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the forest. The Larsons drove away in silence, the events of the day etched into their minds. Years later, they would talk about that night, debating whether the creature had been real or a product of their fear and the flood's chaos. But Dan never doubted what he saw, and every so often, when the rain fell hard and the river swelled, he couldn't help but wonder if the creature was still out there, waiting for the next flood to bring it back to the surface. Story 5. The Rain Ritual. The storm came without warning. Kara, Jake, Lisa, and Matt had set out early that morning, determined to make the most of their weekend hike through the Pinewood Reserve. The forest was dense and lush, with trails that wound through ancient trees and over rocky ridges. They planned to camp near the summit, where they could enjoy sweeping views of the valley below. But as they approached the clearing they'd chosen for their campsite, the weather turned. A heavy curtain of clouds rolled in, darkening the sky. The air became thick and oppressive, carrying the metallic scent of rain. "We need to set up the tents now," Kara said, glancing nervously at the sky. "Yeah, this storm's not messing around," Jake agreed, already unrolling the tarp. They worked quickly, their laughter and banter replaced by the frantic energy of beating the storm. But as they drove the last stakes into the ground, Matt called out, "Hey, come look at this." "What is it now?" Lisa muttered, brushing rain-speckled hair from her face as she followed him. Matt stood at the edge of the clearing, pointing at something partially hidden by the undergrowth. As the others joined him, they saw it, an ancient stone altar, weathered and moss-covered. It was circular, about 6 feet across, with intricate carvings spiraling across its surface. "This is incredible," Kara whispered, running her fingers over the carvings. "Looks like something out of a horror movie," Lisa said, her voice tinged with unease. "Maybe we should leave it alone?" "Oh, come on. Matt said, grinning. It's probably some old ceremonial thing. People used to worship all sorts of stuff out here. The rain began to fall in earnest, fat droplets spattering against the stone. Jake shivered. We should get back to the tents. This storm's gonna be bad. But as the rain soaked the altar, something strange happened. The carvings began to glow faintly, their lines filling with a soft, bluish light. Did you see that? Kara asked, her voice hushed. It's just the water, Matt said, though he didn't sound convinced. No, Lisa said, backing away. That's not normal. The glow intensified, revealing symbols that hadn't been visible before. They were jagged and angular, unlike the smooth spirals of the other carvings. The air around them seemed to hum with energy, a low vibration that made their skin prickle. We need to go, Lisa said firmly. Now. Before anyone could respond, Matt stepped onto the altar. Matt, don't, Kara shouted, but it was too late. As his foot touched the stone, the glow surged, and a pulse of light rippled outward, illuminating the clearing like lightning. Matt froze, his eyes wide, his body rigid. Then he began to laugh. It wasn't his usual laugh, easygoing and infectious. This was deep, guttural, and utterly alien. He turned to face them, and his eyes, they weren't his eyes anymore. They were black, reflective pools, like twin drops of oil. The rain has summoned us, Matt said, though his voice wasn't his own. It was layered, as if multiple voices were speaking through him. We have waited for so long. Matt, stop messing around, Jake said, though his voice trembled. This isn't funny, Kara added, stepping closer to him. But Matt, or whatever was controlling him, ignored them. He stepped off the altar, his movements jerky and unnatural. You have awakened the covenant, he said, his black eyes locking onto Kara. And for that, we are grateful. What covenant? Lisa demanded, her voice rising in panic. Matt tilted his head, the rain dripping down his face. The pact forged in blood. The rain is the key. The water binds us, and now it shall bind you. We're leaving, Jake said, grabbing Matt's arm. Come on, man, snap out of it. Matt's head snapped around to face him, too fast to be human. Leave, he said, his voice mocking. You cannot leave. The ritual has begun. Before Jake could respond, Matt shoved him back with inhuman strength, sending him sprawling into the mud. Matt, please, Kara pleaded, tears mixing with the rain on her face. Matt's expression flickered for a moment, his real self breaking through. Kara, he whispered, his voice trembling. Help me. It hurts. We'll help you, she said, stepping toward him. But the darkness surged back, and the alien voice returned. He is ours now. The rain intensified, pounding against the ground in a deafening roar. The symbols on the altar glowed brighter, casting eerie shadows across the clearing. Kara, Jake, and Lisa huddled together, their minds racing for a way to stop whatever was happening. What do we do? Lisa shouted over the storm. I don't know. Jake replied, his voice shaking. We have to break the connection, Kara said, her eyes on the altar. It started when he stepped on it. Maybe we can. Her words were cut off as Matt let out a blood-curdling scream. His body convulsed, and dark tendrils of smoke began to rise from his skin. The tendrils twisted and writhed, coalescing into shadowy shapes that danced around him. We have to try, Kara shouted, running toward the altar. Kara, wait. Jake called after her, but she was already there. She placed her hands on the glowing stone, hoping to disrupt the ritual. The moment her skin touched it, a shockwave rippled through her, and her mind was flooded with images, ancient rituals, blood sacrifices, and storms that raged for days. She saw shadowy figures bowing before the altar, their faces obscured, their chants filling the air. Kara pulled away, gasping. It's a binding ritual, she said, her voice trembling. They're using the rain to tether themselves to our world. How do we stop it? Lisa asked, her face pale. Before Kara could answer, Matt lunged at her, his movements unnaturally fast. Jake tackled him, struggling to hold him back. Do something, Jake shouted. Kara looked at the altar, then at the symbols glowing on its surface. She grabbed a rock and began smashing at the carvings, chipping away at the ancient stone. The glow flickered, and Matt screamed again, the tendrils of smoke retreating slightly. It's working, Lisa shouted. Kara struck the altar again and again, each blow weakening the glow. The storm seemed to falter, the rain lessening with each strike. Finally, with one last blow, the altar cracked. A blinding flash of light erupted from the stone, and the shadowy tendrils vanished. Matt collapsed, his body limp. The storm passed as quickly as it had come, leaving the clearing eerily silent. The Larsons huddled together, their breaths ragged, their clothes soaked. Matt stirred, his eyes fluttering open. They were normal again, no longer black and lifeless. What happened? He murmured, his voice weak. You're okay, Kara said, tears streaming down her face. They didn't stay to investigate the altar further. Whatever they had awakened, they wanted no part of it. They packed their gear in silence and left the forest, vowing never to return. But as they drove away, Kara couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed them. The memory of those glowing symbols burned into her mind. And every time it rained, she swore she could hear faint whispers on the wind, calling her back to the altar. Story 6. The storm that traps. The storm came with a vengeance. The 4 friends, Emily, David, Sarah, and Mark, had been camping deep in the Whispering Pines forest, a remote area known for its rugged beauty and eerie legends. The trip was supposed to be a break from their stressful city lives, a chance to unwind, share ghost stories, and toast marshmallows over a crackling fire. Instead, they found themselves huddled in their tent as a violent storm battered the campsite. The rain was relentless, drumming against the canvas with an intensity that drowned out their voices. Wind howled through the trees, and thunder rumbled so close it seemed to shake the ground. "This is insane," Sarah muttered, clutching her jacket tighter around her. "They didn't say anything about a storm this bad." David, ever the optimist, tried to lighten the mood. "It's just a little rain. We'll laugh about this tomorrow when the sun's out." But Emily wasn't so sure. She peeked out of the tent flap and gasped. "Guys, look." The campsite was unrecognizable. The rain had turned the ground into a churning sea of mud, thick and dark, stretching as far as the eye could see. The fire pit was submerged, their gear half buried in the muck. Trees loomed like shadowy sentinels, their trunks reflecting the lightning flashes. Mark frowned. "We can't stay here. If this gets worse, we'll be trapped. What do you suggest?" Sarah snapped. "Swim through the mud." Before Mark could retort, there was a strange sound outside, a wet, sucking noise. It was faint at first but grew louder, like the forest itself was shifting. "What the hell is that?" Emily whispered. David unzipped the tent and stepped outside, his boots sinking into the mud. "It's just the storm messing with the ground," he said, though his voice lacked confidence. The others followed reluctantly. The mud clung to their shoes, pulling at their steps with an unnatural weight. It was more than just wet dirt. It felt almost alive, rippling and shifting beneath them. Mark pointed toward the edge of the campsite. "Look at that." A section of the mud was bubbling, as if something was rising to the surface. They watched in stunned silence as a branch emerged, followed by another. But these weren't branches. They were skeletal fingers, clawing their way out of the earth. "Run!" Sarah screamed, but when she tried to move, her feet wouldn't budge. The mud tightened around her ankles, pulling her down with a force that felt deliberate. She struggled, panic setting in as the sucking noise grew louder. "Help me!" David and Emily rushed to her side, grabbing her arms and pulling with all their strength. The mud resisted, stretching like taffy before finally releasing her. They stumbled backward, gasping for breath. "This isn't normal," Emily said, her voice trembling. "We need to get out of here." Mark was already moving toward higher ground, but the mud seemed to anticipate his intent. It shifted beneath him, rising to swallow his feet. He yanked his leg free, only for the other to sink deeper. "Stay together," David shouted. "We'll figure this out." The group huddled close, their eyes darting across the campsite. The skeletal hands had stopped emerging, but the mud itself was moving now, swirling and pulsating like a living organism. "What is this?" Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. Emily, ever the rational one, tried to think. "It's some kind of sinkhole or quicksand. Maybe there's a way to spread our weight. Find something to lie on." David shook his head. "No, this isn't natural. Look at it." He pointed to the swirling patterns forming in the mud, almost like symbols. "It's like it's alive." Hours passed, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. The mud had claimed most of their campsite, swallowing their gear and leaving them stranded on a small patch of semi-solid ground. Every attempt to move only made the situation worse. Then they heard the voice. It was faint at first, barely audible over the storm, but it grew louder, a low, mournful wail that seemed to come from the mud itself. It wasn't human. It was something older, primal, filled with rage and sorrow. "What is that?" Mark asked, his face pale. Emily shivered. "It's coming from the ground." The mud began to rise again, forming shapes. Faces twisted in agony, their mouths open in silent screams. One by one, they appeared, their eyes glowing with a dim, unnatural light. "They're watching us," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper. David crouched down, his hand brushing the edge of one of the symbols in the mud. "These patterns, they're not random. They are writing." "What kind of writing?" Emily asked. "I don't know," David admitted, "but it's ancient." As the storm raged on, the friends pieced together a theory. The mud wasn't just alive. It was cursed, tied to the land in some way they couldn't fully understand. The faces in the mud weren't just watching. They were trapped, bound to the earth by whatever force controlled it. "We have to do something," Emily said. "We can't just sit here and wait to die." "But what can we do?" Mark asked. "We don't even know what this is." David looked at the altar-like rock they'd seen earlier, partially submerged in the mud. "Maybe it's connected to that. If this is some kind of curse, maybe we can break it." Despite their fear, they agreed. The rock was their only hope. Moving toward it was slow and agonizing. Every step a battle against the mud's relentless pull. By the time they reached it, they were exhausted. The rock was covered in the same symbols they'd seen in the mud, glowing faintly in the storm's light. David placed his hand on it, feeling a jolt of energy course through him. "It's a seal," he said. "I think it's holding whatever this is in place." "Then why is it attacking us?" Sarah asked. "Maybe we disturbed it," Emily said. "Maybe it needs something to calm it." "What do we have to give?" Mark asked, his voice bitter. "It's already taken everything." David thought for a moment, then looked down at the mud. "What if it's not about what we give? What if it's about what we take away?" "What do you mean?" Emily asked. "The faces, the people trapped in the mud. Maybe they're not supposed to be here. Maybe we have to free them." They worked together, scraping away at the rock's surface to disrupt the symbols. The mud reacted violently, surging around them like a living tide. The faces screamed, their cries mingling with the storm. Finally, with one last effort, they broke the central symbol. The glow faded, and the mud stilled. The faces sank back into the earth, their expressions peaceful for the first time. The storm began to subside, and the mud hardened into solid ground. The friends stood in silence, their breaths heavy, their bodies covered in muck. "What just happened?" Sarah asked. "We survived," David said. "That's all that matters." They left the campsite the next morning, the forest eerily quiet in the storm's aftermath. None of them spoke of what had happened, but as they reached the trailhead, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they'd only scratched the surface of the forest's dark secrets. And as they drove away, the rain began to fall again, the ground shifting ever so slightly beneath their tires. Story 7. The Rain's Echo. The rain began as a gentle patter on the leaves, a soothing rhythm that blanketed the forest. For Clara, camping alone in the heart of the Black Hollow woods was supposed to be an escape from her fast-paced city life. She'd spent the day exploring trails, sketching wildflowers, and soaking in the silence broken only by the occasional bird call. As evening settled in, she built a small fire, warmed a can of soup, and felt a rare sense of peace. But as the first drops of a heavier rain began to fall, Clara felt the air shift. The woods, once alive with sound, had gone unnervingly quiet. The rain grew heavier, drumming against her tent. She wrapped herself in her sleeping bag, listening to the storm's rhythm, letting it lull her toward sleep. Then she heard it, a scream. It cut through the rain like a blade, sharp and unmistakable. It wasn't distant but close, almost inside her tent. Clara bolted upright, her heart hammering in her chest. She waited, her ears straining against the rain. There was nothing. Maybe it had been her imagination, she thought. Just the wind or the storm playing tricks on her. Then it came again, louder, clearer. It was her voice. Clara froze, her breath caught in her throat. She couldn't explain how she knew it was her scream, but there was no denying it. It sounded exactly like the way she had screamed once before, years ago, when she'd been startled awake by a nightmare. The scream echoed again, and this time it was followed by laughter. Low, guttural, and alien. Clara grabbed her flashlight and unzipped the tent cautiously, stepping into the rain. The beam of light cut through the dark, revealing nothing but wet trees and glistening leaves. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. There was no answer, only the rain. But as she stood there, drenched and shivering, the laughter came again. It wasn't her voice this time. It was deeper, layered, as though multiple people were laughing at once. "Who's there?" Clara demanded, swinging the flashlight in all directions. The laughter stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. Clara retreated to her tent, zipping it shut and clutching the flashlight like a weapon. She tried to rationalize what she'd heard. Maybe someone else was out there, messing with her. Or maybe she was just overtired and imagining things. But deep down, she knew neither explanation made sense. The rain continued to fall, and as the hours dragged on, Clara heard more strange noises. Footsteps splashing through puddles, the crack of branches breaking under unseen weight, and every so often, her own voice screaming somewhere in the distance, always followed by that unnerving laughter. By midnight, she couldn't take it anymore. She packed her bag quickly, deciding to leave despite the storm. The trail back to her car wasn't far, and she reasoned it would be safer to risk the rain than to stay in a place that felt so wrong. She stepped into the downpour, her flashlight guiding her along the muddy path. But as she walked, she noticed something strange. The echoes of her screams seemed to follow her, bouncing between the trees, closer than before. "Just keep going," she whispered to herself, her voice trembling. But then her flashlight flickered. She smacked it against her hand, trying to keep it alive, but it went out completely, leaving her in total darkness. The rain soaked her clothes, the cold biting into her skin. And then she heard it, footsteps behind her. Clara spun around, her heart pounding. She couldn't see anything, but the footsteps were unmistakable, squelching in the mud, drawing closer. "Who's there?" she shouted, her voice cracking. The footsteps stopped, and then the laughter began again. It was louder this time, echoing through the trees surrounding her. Clara's breath came in short gasps as she turned in circles, trying to locate the source. "Stop it," she screamed, her voice breaking. The laughter ceased abruptly, replaced by a voice. Her voice. "Stop it," it mimicked, the words distorted and drawn out. Clara's blood ran cold. She began to run, slipping and sliding through the mud, her hands clawing at tree trunks to keep her balance. The voice called after her, repeating her words, mocking her. "Stop it. Just keep going," it said, its tone twisted and cruel. Clara stumbled into a small clearing, her legs trembling, her lungs burning. The rain poured down harder, turning the ground beneath her into a swamp. She could barely hear her own thoughts over the storm. And then, from the shadows, she saw movement. Figures emerged, cloaked in rain and darkness. They were indistinct, their forms shifting and unnatural, but their eyes glowed faintly in the dim light. Clara backed away, but the mud clung to her feet, making it nearly impossible to move. The figures began to laugh, their voices blending into the same guttural chorus she'd heard all night. One of them stepped closer, and Clara realized with horror that it had her face. "You can't leave," it said, its voice perfectly mimicking hers. Clara screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the storm. The figures closed in, their laughter ringing in her ears. Clara fell to her knees, the mud pulling her down as if it were alive. She clawed at the ground, trying to break free, but it was no use. The last thing she saw was her own face, grinning down at her, before the mud swallowed her completely. Days later, when the storm had passed, a group of hikers stumbled upon Clara's campsite. The tent was intact, her belongings untouched, but there was no sign of her. They found footprints leading into the forest, but they ended abruptly in a patch of dried mud. As they stood there trying to make sense of it, one of the hikers thought they heard something. A faint scream carried on the wind, and then laughter. Story 8. The man in the poncho. The rain had been falling for hours, turning the forest floor into a slick, muddy mess. Jonah had been camping alone in the wildwood forest, hoping for some peace and solitude away from the hustle and bustle of his everyday life. He had hiked in early that morning, set up his tent near a small creek, and spent the day reading, thinking, and occasionally looking up to watch the birds and squirrels darting among the trees. But now, as night descended, something had changed. The wind picked up, and the rain became heavier, slashing against the trees, making it impossible to hear anything but the steady, rhythmic patter of water on leaves. The campfire, which had burned brightly earlier, was now a heap of glowing embers, smothered by the relentless downpour. Jonah huddled beneath the small shelter of his tent, wrapped in a blanket, his flashlight flickering weakly as he tried to read by its dim light. That's when he saw it, just beyond the edge of the trees, standing still as stone, was a figure. The yellow poncho was unmistakable, a bright, almost unnaturally vivid splash of color against the dark woods. The figure was tall, its shape shrouded in the heavy rain. Jonah blinked, unsure if he was seeing things. It wasn't unusual to spot a person from a distance in these parts, but the figure was odd. It didn't move, not even when the rain seemed to intensify. It was as if the figure was frozen in time, rooted in place. Jonah felt a shiver run down his spine, though he tried to ignore it. He thought it was probably just another hiker, someone who had decided to brave the storm for a while. Still, there was something unsettling about the figure's complete stillness. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped outside, determined to approach the figure and confirm that it was just another camper, even though a sinking feeling told him otherwise. The closer Jonah got, the more the figure seemed out of place. It stood at the edge of the trees, motionless, staring toward him. Its poncho, a bright yellow, contrasted sharply with the darkened surroundings. Jonah's heart thudded in his chest as he took slow, cautious steps toward the figure, his shoes sinking slightly in the soft mud. "Hey," Jonah called out, his voice wavering. "You okay? You lost or something?" There was no response, not even a shift of movement. Jonah frowned, a cold unease creeping up his neck. He stopped a few feet away from the figure, squinting into the rain. It was unnervingly silent. He waved his hand, hoping to get a reaction. Still nothing. "Are you?" Jonah's voice trailed off. Something was wrong. He didn't know why he was so certain, but he felt a deep, primal sense that the figure wasn't quite what it seemed. His hand trembled as he took another step forward. He had nearly reached it now, standing directly in front of the figure. His flashlight flickered again, casting an eerie glow on the poncho. For a moment, Jonah felt his breath catch in his throat. The poncho was empty. No head, no body, just the thick, saturated fabric, hanging limply in the rain, as though it had been abandoned there for ages. Jonah's mind raced as he took a step back, his pulse quickening. His hand shook as he reached for his flashlight, which had dimmed once more, casting long, jagged shadows across the figure. Jonah's stomach lurched. The figure in the poncho didn't make sense. How had it been standing there without anyone inside? How had it not moved a muscle? His skin crawled as he looked down at the wet ground, where the mud was disturbed, and fresh footprints led back toward his tent. The prints were large and uneven, like someone or something had walked slowly and deliberately in the rain. He turned toward the direction of his tent, anxiety gripping his chest. His feet sank deep into the mud as he hurried back, his heart racing. The rain was coming down even harder now, but Jonah barely noticed. The cold seeped through his clothes, the wet earth sticking to his shoes. He could feel something creeping at the back of his mind, urging him to move faster, to get back to safety. When he reached his tent, he froze. The footprints that led toward his tent stopped right at its entrance, the wet mud pressing into the fabric of the door. Jonah stared at the marks, his breath coming in sharp bursts. There was no sign of anyone having come inside the tent, but the prints were unmistakable. They were large, almost too large to be human, and they had come from somewhere near the trees, following the exact path Jonah had walked. Suddenly, a loud cracking sound echoed from the woods, like something large snapping under the weight of the rain. Jonah spun around, his flashlight scanning the trees. But all he saw were the shadows, dancing in the rain-soaked woods. His breath caught as he heard something else, soft, almost imperceptible steps in the mud behind him. Someone was walking around the tent. Jonah's heart pounded in his chest. His body was frozen in place, his mind racing, trying to understand what was happening. He turned his head slowly, his pulse roaring in his ears. And there was again the figure in the yellow poncho. But this time it was different. The figure wasn't standing still. It was moving, stepping slowly toward him through the rain, as though it had been waiting for him. The movement was deliberate, mechanical, like something was guiding it, pulling it closer, inch by inch. Jonah felt his breath catch, the sickening sense of dread deepening. It stopped, once again, just outside the light's range, just beyond the edge of the forest. He could still hear it, though, the faint, heavy breathing coming from the poncho, muffled by the rain. His fingers clutched the edge of the tent, his mind a blur of panic and confusion. Why wasn't it leaving? Jonah took a step back, his heart pounding in his chest. His thoughts were scattered, but he knew one thing for sure. The figure was not human. It couldn't be. The yellow poncho fluttered in the rain, but there was no movement inside it, no person, nothing but an eerie, hollow presence that made the air itself feel thick and oppressive. The muddy footprints in the forest. They were the only trace left of the figure. The figure itself was just a memory, fading into the dark. A gust of wind swept through the trees, and the figure vanished, slipping back into the night like a shadow. The rain continued to fall, but the heavy, oppressive silence that had filled the air seemed to lift, and for a moment, Jonah wondered if the entire encounter had been a hallucination brought on by fatigue or the storm. But the footprints were still there, leading from the trees straight to his tent. Jonah couldn't stay. His heart raced as he grabbed his bag, threw on his jacket, and packed up whatever he could. The wind howled outside, and the rain intensified, but he didn't care. The last thing he wanted was to remain in that forest another second, with that thing lurking just beyond the trees. He scrambled to untie the tent ropes, hands shaking, the wind biting at his face. As soon as everything was packed, he bolted, not even looking back. His flashlight bobbed wildly in the rain as he ran through the mud, his feet sinking deeper into the earth. Every footstep echoed in his ears, and he couldn't help but wonder, was the thing still out there, watching him from the shadows? As Jonah stumbled into the clearing and finally reached the trailhead, the rain slowed to a light drizzle. He didn't look back. He couldn't. But as he glanced down at his boots, he noticed something that stopped him dead in his tracks. Fresh mud caked the soles of his shoes, and it wasn't his own print. Someone or something had followed him all the way from the campsite. Story 9. Whispers in the rain. The air was thick with humidity as the group of 5 friends set up their campsite near the edge of the Elder Grove waterfall. The forest surrounding them was dense, with towering trees and a tangled undergrowth, creating a natural barrier to the outside world. It had been a perfect day of hiking, the kind that left them all exhilarated from the fresh mountain air and the quiet beauty of the wild. A gentle mist from the waterfall hung in the air, softening the edges of the world. The sound of rushing water was calming, blending with the rustling of leaves and the occasional bird call. For Jeremy, it was exactly what he needed after weeks of stressful work. Beside him, his friends, Lena, Chris, Mia, and Owen, set up their tents, laughing and joking as they went. As night fell, the rain began to pour down in steady, rhythmic sheets. It wasn't an uncommon sight in this part of the forest, and no one minded. The fire they had built flickered softly, struggling to stay alive under the heavy rain. They huddled together in the shelter of their tents, sharing stories and hot drinks. The world outside reduced to the sound of rain pounding against the earth. But as the night deepened, something changed. Lena was the first to hear it. At first, it was just a soft, murmuring sound in the distance, barely distinguishable from the rain. She leaned out of the entrance of her tent, peering into the downpour, but there was nothing there, just the waterfall's steady roar. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd heard something else, something familiar. Did anyone else hear that? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. What? Chris replied, looking up from his phone, where he was scrolling through photos of their hike. It sounded like someone calling my name, Lena said, frowning. Everyone paused for a moment, their attention drawn to the sounds of the storm. The rain had picked up in intensity, but there was no denying that the night seemed to carry something more, something unnatural. I didn't hear anything, Mia said, shaking her head as she rolled over in her sleeping bag. Lena thought about it for a moment. It had sounded like her name, no doubt. But the rain, the waterfall, it was all blending together, playing tricks on her mind. Maybe it's just the rain, she muttered to herself, trying to shake off the feeling. She turned back into her tent, but the uneasy sensation lingered. It wasn't long before others began to hear it too. Jeremy was the next to hear the whispers. It was faint at first, just his name, spoken softly through the rain. His heart skipped a beat. He looked around, but the camp was still, save for the low hiss of the storm. "Did anyone just call me?" Jeremy asked, his voice suddenly strained. The others exchanged glances. "What are you talking about?" Owen asked, squinting into the rain. "I swear I heard someone say my name," Jeremy said, his voice tight with uncertainty. It sounded like he stopped himself, unsure how to explain. "It's probably the wind or the water," Mia suggested, trying to lighten the mood. "This place is full of strange sounds." But even as she spoke, they all heard it again. The whispers. And this time it was clearer. Lena could have sworn it was her name. Jeremy heard someone calling for help. Chris's voice, faint but unmistakable. Mia, too, heard her own name being repeated in a soft, coaxing tone. "Guys, this is freaking me out," Owen said, his voice shaky. "This isn't normal." The group was unsettled, but no one wanted to admit that they were truly afraid. They had come out here for adventure, for a break from their busy lives, not to be scared of the wilderness. And yet, as the whispers continued, growing louder, more distinct, they couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The rain came down harder. The waterfalls roared, growing louder in the storm, until it felt as though the forest itself was alive with sound. Then it happened. "Help me! Help!" Chris's voice suddenly echoed across the campsite, his tone panicked and desperate. Without thinking, Jeremy bolted out of his tent, flashlight in hand, and headed toward the sound. "Chris? Chris!" he shouted, his heart racing in his chest. But as he ran toward the source of the voice, the sound seemed to shift, pulling him farther into the trees. "Jeremy!" Lena called from behind him. "Where are you going?" But he didn't stop. The voice, still echoing with panic, seemed to pull at him, urging him forward. His mind raced. Was Chris in trouble? Was he hurt? Lena, Mia, Owen, and the others were left in a frantic state, unsure of what was going on. As the rain intensified, they felt an unexplainable urge to follow. One by one, they stepped out of their tents and into the downpour, each of them hearing different calls, their friends' voices luring them in opposite directions. "Lena, help me. I'm here." "Mia, get to the waterfall. I need you." "Owen, it's not what it seems. Get away from the trees." The rain blurred their vision, the shadows of the forest twisting and turning. The voices sounded so real, so desperate, but each time one of them followed the sound, it led them deeper into the woods, farther away from the campsite, and farther from the others. Lena was the first to find herself alone. The calls had led her far from the camp, deeper into the thicket of trees. She stood in a small clearing, listening to the rain pattering against her hood, her breath coming in quick bursts. She glanced nervously over her shoulder, feeling the weight of the isolation pressing on her. "Chris? Jeremy? Mia?" she called, her voice cracking, but no one answered. Instead, she heard the sound of footsteps behind her. Her heart skipped. She turned quickly, but there was no one there. The voices were still calling, her name echoing through the storm. Suddenly, the call stopped. The rain continued to fall, but the eerie silence that followed was worse than the whispers. Lena stood frozen, her breath shallow as the darkness seemed to close in around her. Back at the campsite, Owen, Jeremy, and Mia had also become separated, each of them lured by the call of their friends' voices. Their search for one another felt like a cruel game, the forest turning into a labyrinth of twisting paths and shifting shadows. They could hear each other's voices, but always in the distance. The further they went, the more confused they became. They had heard one another's voices calling, but never close enough to make contact. Something was wrong. It was as if they were walking in circles, chasing their own echoes. Lena stumbled into the clearing again, her heart racing. She was alone. She had been chasing the voices for what felt like hours, but she hadn't found anyone. The rain had soaked her to the bone, her feet heavy in the mud. There was no trace of her friends. Her flashlight's beam flickered and then died entirely, leaving her in the dark, with only the whispering rain and the sound of rushing water. And then, suddenly, the voices began again. Louder now, closer. But this time, it wasn't just one voice. It was all of them, all calling in different directions. Help me. Help. Chris's voice. No. Come to me. I'm right here. Jeremy's voice. Mia, please. Lena's voice. It was madness. The friends were separated, each hearing the other's calls, but never able to reach them. Their minds were fraying, stretched thin by the relentless storm, the eerie whispers, and the deepening fear. In the end, no one knew how long they had been lost in the woods. It felt like hours, maybe days, but when the rain finally stopped, the forest seemed eerily quiet. The voices had faded, leaving only the sound of dripping water and the steady rush of the waterfall. Lena was the first to find her way back to the campsite, but she wasn't alone. One by one, the others returned, each of them looking just as dazed and shaken as she felt. None of them spoke of what had happened. They didn't have to. The terror, the whispers, the feeling of being led away from safety, it was all too fresh, too real. They packed up quickly, leaving the campsite as the first rays of dawn broke through the clouds. The forest behind them seemed to hold its breath, the stillness hanging in the air. As they drove away, no one dared to look back, but the whispers stayed with them, in the rain, in the dark, waiting for the next time the storm would come. Story 10. The Vanishing Trail. The rain had been relentless, drenching the group of friends as they hiked through the dense woods. It had started as a light drizzle in the morning, but by the time they reached the halfway point of their trek, the skies had darkened and the downpour intensified. The trees above offered little protection, and the mud beneath their feet made each step a struggle. Still, they pushed on, determined to reach their planned campsite before nightfall. "Think we'll make it before dark?" Mia asked, adjusting the straps on her backpack. Her breath came out in puffs, visible in the cool, wet air. "We've got about 2 more miles to go," Jeremy replied, glancing at his watch. "If we keep up this pace, we'll be fine." The group of 5, Jeremy, Mia, Chris, Lena, and Owen, had been planning this hiking trip for months. They were all experienced hikers, well prepared for the challenges of the forest. The weather had been an unexpected complication, but they'd been through worse. Nothing could dampen their spirits. "We'll set up camp and ride out the storm," Owen said with a grin, his voice muffled by the rain. How bad can it really get? By the time they arrived at the campsite, a small clearing by a creek, they were thoroughly soaked, their clothes sticking to their skin. The rain hadn't let up, and the chill in the air seeped into their bones. They quickly set up a tarp to shelter themselves, tossing their wet gear underneath, hoping for some reprieve from the elements. Jeremy, the most experienced of the group, started a fire using wet wood, an impressive feat that earned him a round of applause. "Nice work," Lena said, handing him a dry pair of socks. "We'll be warm soon." They gathered around the fire, pulling their wet clothes as close to the heat as they could. The sound of the rain hitting the tarp above was deafening, but it provided a sense of security. The forest outside seemed muffled, as if the rain was closing them off from the rest of the world. But something about the night didn't feel right. The first sign came when they woke up the next morning. The rain had stopped, but a dense fog had rolled in, clinging to the trees like a thick blanket. It was eerily quiet, with only the soft rustling of leaves and the occasional drip from the branches. The friends slowly stirred from their tents, stretching and rubbing their eyes. But when they stepped out to assess the campsite, a cold knot formed in their stomachs. The trail they had followed the previous day, the one that led them into the forest, was gone. We must be disoriented," Chris said, his voice shaky. "It's the fog. We probably just can't see the path clearly." But as they looked around, there was no sign of the familiar trail markers or the path they had cleared through the woods. The dense forest stretched out in every direction, but none of it looked like the trail they had walked the day before. The trees were the same, the rocks and shrubs were the same, but there was no trail. Lena frowned. "No, this isn't right. We followed the trail. We made sure we stayed on it." Jeremy knelt down and examined the ground. He traced the muddy earth with his finger, searching for the faintest trace of their footprints. But there was nothing, no sign of their passage, no evidence they had ever been there. It was as if the forest had swallowed their trail completely. "We have to be in the wrong place," Owen said, trying to stay calm. "Maybe we missed a turn or something." "No, we didn't," Mia insisted, her voice rising in frustration. "We followed the trail. This is the right spot." They all stood in silence for a moment, the tension building. The fog thickened, swirling around them, and the forest seemed to close in. It felt like they were being watched, like the trees were waiting, listening. "We need to figure this out," Jeremy said, trying to sound confident. "Let's go back to the camp and recheck our gear. Maybe we missed something." The group returned to their campsite, hoping to find some sign of clarity. But when they reached the tarp where they had left their gear, their unease deepened. Everything was wet. They had covered their backpacks, tents, and supplies with a tarp, protecting them from the rain. But now, every single item, everything that had been sheltered under the tarp, was completely soaked. Their sleeping bags were drenched, the clothes inside their packs wet, and even the food they had stored was soggy and ruined. There was no logical explanation for it. "I don't get it," Chris muttered. "We were under the tarp. Nothing should be wet." Lena kneeled down, carefully touching her soggy backpack. "This doesn't make sense. The rain stopped hours ago." "I checked the tarp," Owen added, his voice rising in panic. The tarp was secure. No way it could have leaked. The group stared at their ruined gear, the silence hanging heavy between them. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. With no other options, the group decided to try retracing their steps, hoping they could somehow find their way back to the trail. They packed up what little they could salvage from their soggy gear and began walking, each step taken with more uncertainty than the last. But the forest didn't look familiar. No matter how far they walked, no matter which direction they tried, the trees, the rocks, the landscape, everything seemed the same. "Why does it feel like we're just walking in circles?" Mia asked, her voice tinged with panic. She was sweating despite the chill in the air, the weight of their situation pressing down on her. "We are walking in circles," Jeremy said, his voice strained. "We've been walking for hours and nothing's changed. This is impossible." The group fell into a heavy silence as they continued, their pace slow and deliberate, trying to make sense of what was happening. But the deeper they went, the more the feeling of being trapped in some kind of loop intensified. Night fell again, and the friends set up camp as best as they could. They didn't talk much. Their earlier attempts to retrace their steps had led nowhere. The trail was still gone. It was as if the forest had erased it entirely. "Should we just call for help?" Owen asked, though his voice lacked conviction. "We have cell phones. We can't be the only ones out here." But when they pulled out their phones, they saw there was no signal. No bars, no service. Just dead air. "We're on our own," Jeremy said quietly, putting his phone away. His voice sounded hollow. The rain began again, falling softly at first, but then growing heavier as the night deepened. The sound of it, mingling with the steady rush of the creek, was deafening. But the strange thing was, none of the other animals seemed to be bothered by it. The forest was eerily quiet. No frogs croaked. No insects hummed. There was no rustling of animals in the brush. The rain continued through the night, relentlessly washing over them, soaking everything again, even though their camp had been set up under the tarp. The next morning, they woke to find the same thing had happened. Their gear, again, was soaked, even though the tarp had held. It was as though the rain had come back during the night and drenched everything anew. "How is this possible?" Lena whispered, her face pale and exhausted. "We've been here for days now. This isn't just weather. Something's wrong. Something's changed." They all looked at each other, a shared understanding dawning in their eyes. They weren't just lost. They were being affected by something beyond their control. something the forest itself was doing. Over the next few days, the group tried to stay calm, but their nerves were frayed. The trail never reappeared. Their gear continued to soak, as if the rain was drawn to them alone. They were trapped, isolated in the middle of the forest, with no way to find their way out. The forest itself seemed to have become a maze, shifting and moving in ways they couldn't understand. And then one night, just as they were about to give up, a whisper echoed through the trees. It was faint, barely audible through the steady rain, but it was there. You shouldn't have come. The group froze, each of them straining to listen. The voice wasn't one of them. It was someone or something else. From that moment on, they knew they weren't alone in the forest. Something was watching them, and it wasn't about to let them leave.